So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out. This is a very special moment in our history. Pittsylvania County, we are here today on the very spot where a very momentous event occurred exactly 250 years ago today on our march towards independence and establishing our own freely elected government in this county. Now we're going to do a program. I'm going to talk about the event that happened. We're going to read the newspaper description of it. We're going to announce the names of the committee members who were selected here. We're going to honor those men. But the first thing we want to do before we do any of that, we're going to ask our Sons of the American Revolution Color Guard to please come forward and present the colors.
Carry on. Right face. Mark time. Mark. Forward. Mark. Mark time. Halt. Left face. Present colors.
Please join me in pledging allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Shoulder colors. Post national colors. Post remaining colors. Carry firelocks. Right face. Mark time. March. Forward. March.
Before we get to the main event, before we announce the names of the committee members and talk about the newspaper account of that day, I think it's important that we stop and reflect on what the historical context was that led us up to this moment. In other words, what happened that caused the event that occurred here 250 years ago today to be important? What were the events that led up to it? And what were the consequences of it? By the way, if you can't hear me, please step a little closer. I'm going to do my best to project. So first of all, I know many of you are going to know this. Those of you who know this history, just bear with me. But the disputes between the British North American colonies and the mother country had been going on for over a decade. And on and off, we had tensions and crises resulting in, that followed attempts to infringe American liberties, and then the American patriots would react to that. In the 1860s, we had the stamp tax crisis. Now, those of you who remember what happened, Parliament enacted a tax to be imposed on every piece of paper sold in the colonies, or printed in the colonies, whether it was a deed or a court paper, a newspaper, or a pack of playing cards. It didn't matter, there was a tax on it. The American colonists said, hold on a second. We didn't vote this tax in on ourselves. This tax was enacted by Parliament. We have no representatives in Parliament, so we are not going to pay this tax. The crisis resulted, but because of the resistance of the American colonists, the refusal to pay a tax that was imposed on them by a legislature they did not have representatives in, and thanks to the ardent support in Parliament of William Pitt, that tax was repealed in 1766. The next year, Pittsylvania County was formed, 1767. And in honor of William Pitt, who stood up for our rights in Parliament, the county was named Pittsylvania County. The crisis subsided, but then it came back again in the 1770s. And this time, it was something called the Townshend Act, or the Townshend Duties. Parliament again imposed a series of taxes on the American colonists, again, without having any representatives of America involved in the imposition of that tax. They imposed the tax, and again, Americans stood up and said, no, this is unjust, This is infringement of our liberties. We will not pay a tax that is being imposed on us by a legislature that we aren't represented in. If our legislatures, our colonial legislatures pass a tax, we'll pay it. But if the British Parliament passes a tax, we're not going to pay it. We won't consent to it. Again, widespread opposition to that tax, and again it was repealed. But the British left in place, because they refused to concede the point, they left in place a small tax on tea. But that didn't much matter to the colonists at the time, because although we greatly enjoyed our tea, just as they did in Britain, most of the tea that was coming into the colonies was being smuggled in from the West Indies, and we weren't paying any tax on that anyway. So it didn't really create much of a problem. The colonists continued to say we're not paying that tax, but because our tea wasn't coming in through official channels generally, it didn't matter. Well, the British weren't going to allow that to continue forever, so what they did is they concocted a scheme where they worked the deal out with the East India Company to cause the price of tea to come way down, where it was now undercutting the cost of the smuggled tea. So they said, oh, these colonists, they're going to be really pleased to now get their tea a lot cheaper. And they figured if they're getting their tea cheaper, they're not going to mind a tiny little tax we put on it as principal. Well, they figured wrong, because the colonists said, we know exactly what you're doing, and we're not paying the tax on that tea, and we're not going to drink the tea. And once again, the Sons of Liberty and the American colonists who were supporting our liberties reacted against that. When the British tried to unload that tea in places like Charleston and Baltimore and Norfolk, the Sons of Liberty there prevented the tea from coming in. They wouldn't allow it to be unloaded. Well, we know what happened in Boston. The royal governor there wouldn't back down. He said, I'm going to unload this tea no matter what. And he said, if I have to stay, if it takes me however long it takes, that tea's coming off of those ships into Boston. So at that point, the Sons of Liberty in Boston decided, well, we'll just take matters into our own hands. A lot of them disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, rode out into Boston Harbor, boarded the ships, burst open the kegs of tea, and dumped it all in Boston Harbor. That's the Boston Tea Party that we all know. That did not go over well in London. So after that, Parliament enacted a series of laws which we called in America the Intolerable Acts. One of those acts, the Massachusetts Government Act, for example, said Massachusetts can now no longer have their own governments, their own courts. One was the Quartering Act that said we can put British soldiers in citizens' homes if we want to. The one that was the most notorious was the Boston Port Act. What that act did was close the Port of Boston. This is all relevant, by the way, to what happened here, as you're going to see in a second. They closed the Port of Boston and said no merchandise will come in or out of Boston until that tea is paid for. And they put a British army in Boston. So they occupied the city and closed the port. Well, closing the Port of Boston created a severe hardship for the people of Boston. That's how they made their living. That's where they got their necessaries. All across America now, for one of the first times, the colonies started to unite. They stood beside the Bostonians, whether they agreed with the Tea Party or not. And plenty of patriotic Americans thought that that was going too far to destroy that tea. But they said, look, if they can do this to Boston, they can do it to us. And we got to stand up with the Bostonians here. And all across America, from Georgia to New England, citizens contributed food and clothing and materials and shipped it up to Boston to relieve the people of Boston who were suffering from this embargo. The Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia. Now, we were still British subjects. This was a year before the Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress was not an official governmental body. These were delegates from the colonies who went to Philadelphia to try to find a way to work together to overcome these British impositions on American liberty. The Continental Congress passed what they called a non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreement, citing the repeated infringements on the rights and liberties of the colonies, including the, quote, cruel and oppressive acts respecting Boston. Now what that non-exportation agreement did was said we are not going to buy or sell, not going to sell anything to Britain, not going to buy anything from Britain. But there was no government to enforce that law. The only government that existed in the colonies was the royal government. So what the Continental Congress did was in their Articles of Association, was say the following. We direct that a committee be chosen in every county, city, and town by those qualified to vote for representatives in the legislature, whose business it shall be to attentively observe the conduct of all persons touching this association. And when it shall be made to appear to the satisfaction of a majority of such committees that any persons within the limit of their appointment has violated this association, that such a majority do forthwith cause the truth of the case to be published, to the end that all such foes of the rights of British America may be publicly known, universally condemned as enemies of American liberty, and that we will henceforth respectively break off all dealings with him or her. In other words, we ask every community in America to appoint a committee whose job it will be to be on the lookout for who's not honoring this non-import, non-export agreement. And when you find anybody that's doing it, they're to be publicly exposed, shamed, and ridiculed. Because again, you couldn't put them in jail because we were still British subjects. So those committees, which were called committees of inspection or committees of observation, started to be formed. And thus, right here on January 26, 1775, Pittsylvanians, a large number of Pittsylvanians, gathered in this building to select the committee of inspection that was going to be essentially the police force to enforce this non-importation agreement. And they selected 31 prominent citizens to serve on that committee. And they did their job. They did it well. Less than a month after the committee was formed, they summoned to appear before them a certain Pittsylvania County resident named John Pigg. Now, y'all may know the story of Mr. Pigg. It's interesting. But I'm going to read you now what the Virginia Gazette reported about that. This is on February 22, 1775. A complaint was made to this committee that a certain John Pigg has violated the association by drinking and making use of in his family the detestable tea. And also the said Pigg has taken uncommon pains in order to defeat the intention of the association by exclaiming against the measures adopted by the General Congress, upon which the said Pigg was summoned to appear before the committee. And he absolutely refused to do so. He declared that the person who gave him notice that it was his intention to do as he pleased, and that he would not pay any regard to the summons of the committee. Whereupon it was the opinion of the committee that the said Pigg ought to be looked upon as a traitor to his country and inimical to American liberty. And it is recommended to all people to break off all intercourse in connection with said Pigg until such time as he repudiates himself, reinflates himself in the goodwill and affection of the people of the county. So in other words, Mr. Pigg said, you can stop it. I'm going to drink tea if I want to, and I'm not coming to your committee. And the committee's response was to hold him out as a traitor. But that's all they really had the power to do. And by the way, the men who did that, the men who were on this committee, were in effect committing treason, and had things not gone the way they had hoped, they were in fact putting their lives on the line by doing that. But you know, things were about to take a very dramatic change, and this committee of inspection, whose job it was to just look out for tea drinkers, was about to have something far more serious to do. In April of 1775, so that's 2 months after John Pigg came here, well, refused to come here, 3 months after we formed the committee here, the British decided that it getting kind of dangerous outside of Boston because the militia there had a very formidable arsenal out in Concord. So they came up with a plan. They're going to march out of Boston. They're going to do a sneak march out. They're going to march out to Concord. They're going to seize these guns and ammunition and take it from the militia so they won't have it to use against them. Spies, Patriot spies in Boston found out about it, sent the word out. Riders raced across the country giving the alarm. The Minutemen all gathered their guns and showed up at Concord. Some were at Lexington, blocked the British march. When the British got there, there were militiamen in the road, farmers and shopkeepers with their guns. The commander of the American militia there said, "Gentlemen, hold your fire. But if they mean to have a war, let it start right here. And to this day, we don't know who fired the first shot. That day, the shots were fired, blood was shed, Americans were killed defending their liberties. They resisted it, conquered. The British had to retreat back to Boston. They were peppered and fired upon the entire way by militiamen who were pouring in from all over Massachusetts. The war was on. So now, here in this committee that we're talking about today, had some much more serious business to do. In July, delegates gathered at a revolutionary convention in Richmond, and they voted to take over the government of Virginia from the royal authorities. By the way, this was a year before the Declaration of Independence. And in Virginia, in July of 1775, we said, we're taking over control of the state from the royal authorities. And they said, mobilize and arm the militia. Prepare the defense of the state. Our committee was represented there in Richmond that day by two of its members, Benjamin Langford and Peter Perkins. The state was organized into military districts. There were here in Pittsylvania County 1,439 men eligible for militia duty. And by September, our committee had organized them into 27 companies under the overall command of Colonel John Donaldson and Colonel Robert Williams. At least 18 of those original 31 committee members were commissioned officers in the militia. Some would go on to serve with great distinction, such as Peter Perkins, who commanded the Pittsylvania militia in their heroic conduct at the Battle of Guerrant Courthouse, which changed the course of that battle, which changed the course of American history. Original committee member Henry Conway was commissioned in the Continental Line. He gave his life for his country at the Battle of Trenton. Peter Sanders was a member of the committee. He went on to serve as an officer in the Henry County Militia. Other original members of the committee served as justices and in other capacities. One even turned out to be a Tory. By 1775, by September of 1775, that Committee of Safety that we're here to honor today was, in fact, the de facto government here in Pittsylvania County. By stepping up and putting their lives on the line, those committee members created a government, a way that we could govern ourselves that prevented a descent into anarchy and that protected gave us the ability to protect ourselves as the war expanded. Now, let's travel back in time. Let's just try to imagine 250 years ago today. Here we are, here at this courthouse. Citizens from all over the county have gathered. And I want to read you. We're very fortunate, by the way, because William Peters Martin, who was a young Pittsylvania County lawyer, who was elected to be the clerk on the committee, wrote down what happened, and he sent a report of it to the Virginia Gazette in Williamsburg, and they published it. So let me read you what was said. Martin wrote, during the time of the choosing of the committee, the utmost good order and harmony prevailed, and all of the inhabitants of the county then present, which were very numerous, seemed determined and resolute in defending their liberties and properties at the risk of their lives, and if required, to die by their fellow sufferers, the Bostonians, whose cause they considered to be their own. He goes on to say that they passed the hat basically and raised the money to reimburse the expenses of our delegates, Peter Perkins and Benjamin Langford. And then he said the committee rose, and after several loyal and patriotic toasts were drunk, the committee dispersed, well pleased with the people they had put their confidence in. I think that's worth reflecting on some of what he said again, reflecting on it again. The utmost good order and harmony prevailed. Citizens from all over the county came here, determined and resolute, he says, to defend their liberties at the risk of their lives. And they chose committee members who they felt they well pleased to have put their confidence in. Now, I'm going to now read out the names of these original committee members on our Committee of Inspection, later became a Committee of Safety. After I'm done, our friends from the Sons of the American Revolution are going to lead us in honoring these men with a cheer. We're going to do it in the 18th century way. They didn't say hurrah, hooray. They said huzzah. We're going to give them 3 huzzahs, and then they're going to fire a ceremonial salute, a volley, 3 rounds of 3 muskets. Now, I'm going to read these names. These are the original committee members chosen by Pittsylvania 250 years ago today on this spot. As I read their names, if the man's name I read also became a commissioned officer, I'm going to raise my finger like this. Okay? So here they are. Charles Adams, Isaac Clement, Henry Conway, who gave his life, Thomas Dillard, the Reverend Louis Gilliam, Arthur Hopkins, Benjamin Langford, William Peters Martin, John Payne, father of Dolly Madison, Abraham Penn, Peter Perkins, Joseph Roberts, John Salmon, Peter Sanders, Abraham Shelton, Crispin Shelton, Daniel Shelton, Gabriel Shelton, William Short, Edmund Taylor, Thomas Terry, William Todd, Richard Walden, James Walker, Henry Williams, Robert Williams, John Wilson, Peter Wilson, and William Witcher. I want to thank you all for attending and keeping in memory of these patriots and their cause alive, for which they risked everything. Let's all now, thinking back on those gentlemen who stood up for our liberties that day, let's give them 3 cheers. Let's go, huzzah! 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 All right, gentlemen. Make ready. Take aim. Fire! Prime and load. Make ready. Take aim. Take aim. Fire. All right, I invite you all to join us at the clerk's office across the road. We've got hot cider and refreshments. We will not, unfortunately, be having a round of patriotic toasts with cherry bounce, as these men did, but feel free to lift a glass in their honor when you get home. And thanks you all for coming out, and we'll meet back here, same place, same time, 250 years from now.